right, so again, my name is Jason Schley. We started a crop consulting business back in the year 2000 roughly, out of Alpena, South Dakota. So if you think of Highway 281, we're right on Highway 281, just a little bit east. If you go west of 281, 30, 40 miles, 25 years ago, you know, it was primarily pasture ground. Now it's mostly farm ground, but things have really changed. But anyway, I always use 281 for a dividing factor. If you go west, you know, you're hoping to shoot for 150 bushel. You go to 30 miles east and you're shooting for 250 bushel. So a huge cutoff there on Highway 281. Got a customer actually that I started consulting with. He's here today, Joe Fritz. He has out of Wessington, but my original business, that's what we did. We did crop consulting, which means week to week, just help guys identify weeds, you know, what to spray, look for diseases, help them with hybrid decisions, things of that nature. Roughly in 2009, you know, that's when things really changed in my eyes as far as what my future held as a consultant, because Roundup Ready was working, right? We were turning cowboys into farmers overnight, and all you really had to do is spray every 21 days. So we started focusing more on fertility. For one, I could just watch the west of 281 guys versus the east of 281 guys, and the guys that have been farming for years versus the guys that are just really getting into more production. And guys that manage fertility always had a huge advantage when we got into a dry spell. So again, when you watch that year after year, you just start focusing on why is that? How can we make these guys on the west side of 281 more efficient with every drop of water? I've got some slides on that as well. But basically just understanding that if we can get a nutrient-dense plant, what that does as far as structure, how much light it captures, and ultimately how much nutrition we can cycle for free when we do that. So a little bit more, basically we started a lab in, I think this is our year 6 or 7, I should know that. But we started a lab, and the reason we started a lab, it was because, again, we were consulting on a lot of acres, and we wanted to be better at predicting what that plant was going to get out of its soil for free, okay? So what we were doing was doing whole plant studies. So this is the history of how we got started. We did whole plant studies. We were cutting the plant off at the base of the ground. We took the tassel, the ear, ground it up on a 1/1000th of an acre basis, and then compared that to a soil test. And when I say soil test, just a standard university soil test, right? And so at the end of the day, you'd actually know if you took up 290 pounds of potassium, 250 pounds of phosphorus, or nitrogen, 70 pounds of phosphorus, etc. You would know exactly what you took up, and then again, you would compare that to a soil test. We did this for 3 years and had very, very little luck. In fact, we were only right 51.7% of the time if you took all of our nutrition, what the soil test told us, and then what the plant took up. And if we were trying to use the soil test just to predict that, we could only predict that 51.7% of the time. So extremely poor numbers, right? So how do you build a business off of data that didn't really work? So then we went into the stage of, hey, there's way more to the soil than we really understood. And a great example of that is we had 2 growers within this grower group that we were taking these whole plant studies from. One grower, I consider him an old-fashioned type grower, meaning he had winter wheat, spring wheat, alfalfa, sunflowers, you know, beans, corn, etc. Another grower, he just got out of college. We consulted for his dad, and we got back to the farm. He said, I still want you to consult, but I really want you to change your fertility. We want you to get way higher phosphorus levels in our soils. So we did. We basically put a floor at 25 part per million on his soils. This other guy that I talked about as being an old-fashioned gentleman as far as farming goes, he was a no-till guy. Again, didn't care about the markets, just kept farming. He would apply potassium, sulfur, and nitrogen, but he never applied phosphorus. This other guy, again, I already told you about, he's very aggressive on the phosphorus side, but he was heavy tillage, and if soybeans, for instance, was profitable, he'd run soybeans 7, 8 years in a row. Ultimately, at the end of these 3 years of studying, these whole plant studies, we had we weren't looking for this data, but this guy that never applied phosphorus actually had higher phosphorus uptake over the 3 years. In fact, he was listed number 3rd out of all of our growers. And this guy that just pounds the phosphorus, he ended up being darn near at the bottom of our list of 25 people as far as phosphorus uptake. So why is that? You know, that's really what got us thinking. And the other thing that really got us thinking is this Lawrence is his name, but Lawrence's numbers were always 2 to 4, 5, 6, 7 part per million phosphorus. He was raising darn good crops. Why didn't those 2s, 4s, 5s ever go to 0, right? He's taking phosphorus out because he had a heck of a crop. Why didn't they ever go down? They just hovered around that 2 to 5. So again, it made us think that there was way more to this soil thing than what we were taught. So we sent our data to just about anybody that would talk to us, and ultimately, universities weren't that interested. They just kept saying, well, tissue data is not correlated, you know, no. Anyway, finally a couple people were pretty interested, and they were Will Britton out of Woods End Labs in Maine, and then Rick Heaney out of Temple, Texas. Rick Heaney was working on a new a new soil extraction process that he would look at, try to mimic nature again. So mimic nature, what that means is, as a plant captures sunlight, it goes through a photosynthetic process, and then it's going to kick exudates out through its root system. Those exudates are going to be sugars, right? Sugars there to feed the bacteria and the biology, to bring it to have association, and then acids. Those acids are there to break down the nutrient bond from the soil, okay? So he was working on that. Will Brent was working on, hey, we need to understand how these microbes, how effective they are at releasing nutrition within our soil. So he was putting a lot of effort into how do we best manage microbes and how do we best measure how active our soils are, okay? So these two guys were looking at it completely different than I've ever heard. So what we did the following year is utilize 3 labs. The lab we were working with, conventional lab, and then those 2 labs, and then redid everything what we had done the prior 3 years, and it really opened our eyes. Instead of being 51.7% accurate at predicting it, we were close to 70% as far as predicting how many pounds on a rough range of what that plant could take up. So what I'll go through today is really what we did is we took the culmination of those 3 labs. It was too expensive to keep doing what we were doing, send it to 3 labs, so we built the lab, and really I'm just going to break into NPK and calcium, how we look at it differently than most labs. Again, this is the first hour, and then later we'll get into high yields. But the big thing that we learned is from the older generation versus the new generation, what I was telling you about that story and that phosphorus, is that there's way more that goes on in the soil than just chemistry. And that's all we were ever taught, is look at inorganic chemistry. And the reason we were taught to look at inorganic chemistry is because that's the plant food that the crops can see, is the inorganic state, right? That you have plenty of organic nutrition in your soil, but it's got to be in the inorganic state before the plant's going to recognize it. So that's what all soil labs have done in the last 70 years, is basically measure that inorganic. But what we didn't look at is the actual physical presence of that soil. Does that soil have oxygen? Does it have stability to it? Also, we didn't look at how active our soil is as far as biology. And that's really, really important, because as we're learning, and I'll share a lot of slides with you here, but the biology of that soil really is, the total nutrition of that plant's really dependent on how active that biology is, especially when you get to mid and late season in the corn crop. So obviously we can wide drop and we can fertigate, we can do some things, but the most simple way to do it is spoon feed through biology, and we'll talk about that. So again, we built the soil test that truthfully, now you see this everywhere, right? I mean, now it's in every farm magazine. But Joe and I, we actually went to a no-till in the plains. It was 2005 roughly. You know, at that time when you'd heard cover crops, biology, it wasn't a big deal. Now you're hearing it everywhere. When we started actually playing with this, would have been in 2011. It just took us a long time to really grasp it and understand it. And I say that because that's the difference between our lab and most. It's not about trying to kick out a bunch of numbers. It's really we put way more of our effort into truly understanding what the numbers mean and how to make them practical on a farm basis. So everything on the left there in red, that's what you've traditionally seen in a soil test. Everything on the right is what we've added to it. We still measure everything on the left because we still feel there's value in that. But everything on the right, we've added. And this year we'll talk about a lot, especially in the high yield side, but you have to understand this to truly understand the soil. So if you think of the soil in nutritional forms. So you've got 3 pools of nutrition in your soil. You've got the total pool, which is your far left, right? We measure that in our lab because we think it's very, very important, especially as guys are looking at adding biologicals and releasing more out of their soil. But if you go to a soil health meeting, for instance, they'll say, hey, you don't need to add phosphorus because you get thousands of pounds of phosphorus. You don't need to add calcium because you get thousands of pounds of calcium. Well, that's true, but the only way we can get it out of our soil is if we acid digest it, okay? So that's the total pool. And then you've got your extractable pool. This is more what I call the university type measurement, okay? You're looking at the inorganic nutrients, not necessarily the form that they're in, but you're looking at the total inorganic nutrients that are extracted. Then the far right pool, that's the plant available pool. That's when we're using the root exudate from that plant and extracting that same soil. So this is the pool that the plants today, you could pull a sample today and you can see it says 8 pounds of phosphorus. That's what that plant's seeing today as far as availability goes. Okay, these pools always go back and forth to another. one another. So that far right pool, you might think, let's put all of our nutrition there, right? So I'm going to use an example. If I put on 100 pounds of phosphorus in that soil, and we broke it down, and 100 pounds was available, eventually it would work its way back over to the total pool, you go back to the extract pool, and vice versa. It's a non-stop ending cycle. And the reason that is because you have nutrient tie-up and interactions, right? So when you have interactions, you're going to take things and make them insoluble. So in other words, you've got iron and aluminum. What's it going to do? It's going to fix phosphorus. You're going to have aluminum phosphate, iron phosphate. That's not in the plant available form because, again, that plant doesn't even recognize it as plant food, even though it's phosphorus, okay? So I really want you to understand this slide because it's darn important as far as looking at chemistry interactions and why we feel that you need to look at all 3 extraction pools in our soil test. So we'll just walk through traditional way of thinking of nitrogen. Typically, you're going to look at your yield goal, right? We're using corn here for an example. We're going to use 1.2 units of N. Then we're going to subtract maybe organic matter credits, potentially, nitrate numbers, potentially, maybe even ammonium, right? That's how you typically looked at nitrogen the last 50 years of what we've had to learn from the soil test. What we do is again, pay attention to every interaction within here. So what's going to affect nitrogen? Does anybody, if we overload something, anybody study interactions much?
Potassium.
What's that?
Potassium.
Yeah, you bet. Potassium would be one. There's all kinds of things, and we'll walk through why. Magnesium. Let's use magnesium for example, right? You guys know if you get high mag soils, what happens? Your nitrogen use efficiency drops, right? And that's not just because of this interaction chart, but it's also because of the fact that your soils don't have oxygen in them when they get high mag soils, right? You don't have that porosity in your soils. So again, knowing that, we know magnesium is not a true chemistry interaction, it's more of a soil structure interaction. So we understand right then and there that if you don't have oxygen, you don't get enough nitrogen. Well, why is that? It's because if you have oxygen, you can work in that big pool and convert it to a little pool. It has nothing to do with a true tie-up, like most think. It has more to do with the fact that you don't, when you have high mag soils, you have limited root structure and limited oxygen in that profile. So these are the things that we look at when we look at nitrogen. We look at SLAM, which to me is I love that number. It's an amino acid protein, basically. It's a nitrogen that it's slow release into the system. How I utilize it best is, let's just say a grower comes to me and he has 10,000 acres of corn. He said, I can't side dress every acre. Identify which fields I'm going to get the best bang for my dollar. We'll use SLAN for that. If I've got high numbers of SLAN, typically we're going to get very little response to a late season nitrogen application. If I have low levels of SLAN, it's an automatic, I'm side dressing that field, okay? So that's how I use SLAN. Organic nitrogen is your total pool. So back when 10 years ago, what did we do? We looked at organic matter and estimated how much nitrogen would come out of organic matter, okay? Well, the reason that number's jumped is because what we were truly trying to do is estimate how much organic N was within that organic matter. The organic matter itself didn't do anything for nitrogen, it held organic N. Well, we can measure that, so there's no reason to guess on it. So we're measuring the organic nitrogen. And then, of course, we look at nitrate ammonium. Then on the bottom left, you'll see VAST. VAST is a soil structure score. What that's doing is taking your soil, dipping it 15 times into water, a laser runs across it, and basically it's telling you what percent of your soil held up through that stress of dipping that soil. So if I started with 100 grams and ended with 3 grams, we'll rate it as a 3%. That 3% is terrible. It's meaning that you have no structure in your soil, no glomalin, right? Nothing to hold it together. Well, that has a huge effect on your nitrogen because, again, if you don't have soil structure, you don't have rooting depth, you don't have oxygen. You can't get any free N out of it. Then, of course, we look at the biological activity level, which we use a Lycor machine. And then we look at pH and then the CN ratio. And that CN ratio is important. We do a lot of, everybody knows if you go corn after corn, you add a little extra in. If you go corn after wheat, you add a little extra in, right? The reason you're doing that is because the carbon is tying up your nitrogen. So a lot of people like to say, okay, you got a CEC of 10, so you can put 100 pounds of nitrogen out there without it leaching out, right? That's what people tell you. It's pretty standard. But in reality, that's junk too. The real thing that's tying it up isn't your soil. Humin in your soil, the humus in your soil can hold nitrogen, but everything else isn't. So cation exchange capacity really has nothing to do with it. What's truly doing it is higher cation soil, right? If I have a 25 CEC soil or if I have a 5 CEC soil, what changes? Organic matter levels, right? That's what's holding your nitrogen, is your organic matter within them CEC. So instead of estimating it based on CEC, we're actually giving you a CN ratio. And what that means as far as management goes is, if I've got a wide CN, let's just say I've got 20-to-1 CN, it's telling me I have to put more nitrogen up front, but it's also telling me it's a soil that will hold more nitrogen because it's got the carbon capacity to hold it, because that's what's going to tie it up, just like corn on corn, corn on wheat, right? If I've got a low CN ratio, what it's telling me is I don't need to put much nitrogen up front, and I don't have much storing power. So let's blend that out and push it later in the year. So what inhibits nitrogen are things like we talked earlier, high magnesium soils, right? That's the calcium and magnesium ratio becomes a real play when you look at how much free N you're going to get from biological activity. And again, the form of nitrogen has a huge effect as well, and we'll talk about that as we go. I mentioned earlier that organic matter didn't do a very good job of representing how much nitrogen got released in that soil. So this is Penn State and University of Minnesota data, but basically both data sets are the same thing. It's comparing organic matter in comparison to nitrogen that was released naturally in that soil system, okay? So it says, on the left-hand side, it says your carbon, organic matter to nitrogen release had an R value of 0.34, so terrible correlation. You look at that in comparison to how active your soils are as far as biological activity goes, and we take that R value all the way up to a 0.9. And again, very, very similar here on the test from University of Minnesota. It's just telling you that it doesn't matter how much organic matter you have if you don't have biological activity to break it down and feed it to your crop. That's all this is telling you. Same thing is so we know microbial activity is going to drive free nitrogen, but what drives microbial activity, right? Well, pH is important. If you don't have a pH imbalance, then you can't grow. That's for one. But for two, and this is again my favorite part of the soil test, it's water extract organic carbon. Everybody's taught organic matter is such a big player, and it is a big player. It's in player in structure, it's in player in moisture holding capacity and other things, but it doesn't necessarily give us a good indication as far as, again, how much nitrogen it's going to release or how much biology it can support. And what I mean by that is you can apply biology all day, every day, but if you don't have the food source to keep it alive, you're going to have to keep applying it, right? And you just don't have the supply of food to keep it active. And that's why you hear things of cover crops and things, right? They're adding multi-species cover crops. The reason why is they can get multiple different sugar complexes basically built in that soil, which is ultimately your WEOC, your water extract organic carbon. So again, as water extract organic carbon goes up, your microbial activity goes up. You can see there's an R value there of 0.83. When you look at organic matter in comparison to microbial activity, it's a 0.43. Again, it's very low because that doesn't mean quality. Organic matter doesn't mean the quality of your carbon, where WEOC is the quality, okay? So there's a big difference. Biology wants quality food if it's going to be active at a high level. Phosphorus. Any question on nitrogen? I'm done on nitrogen. Any questions on that? Is that anything?
Jason, maybe just, I think you're going to get into it later.
Yes.
Maybe go over what happens when you apply 200 pounds of nitrogen up front? What happens in the soil?
Well, there's all kinds of things that happens when you put 200 pounds of nitrogen up front, but for one, you're precipitating out other nutrients. It's competing with other nutrients, okay? You're pushing calcium out for darn sure. I mean, guys that put 200 pounds out typically struggle to get sulfur in the plant. They typically struggle to get calcium in the plant earlier. We'll talk about that in the high yield side more. I'll talk a lot more about that. But the other real big thing it's a disaster, really. Think about soil as far as biology goes. You've got bacteria in your soil that's roughly a 5-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, okay? You've got fungi that's roughly 25-to-1. You've got protozoa roughly 50-to-1. Why that's important is because for every pound of nitrogen, if I'm a 5-to-1 bacteria out here, right? For every pound of nitrogen that's left in my system and I go feed on that, I've got to find 5 parts carbon, okay? If I'm fungi, I've got to go find 25 parts carbon. Well, what happens in that system is as I'm dying, as I'm getting fed on, that's an evolution in that soil that's happening every minute, I'm releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. I'm losing what was stored carbon and I'm forcing it out because I over-applied nitrogen. So I always talk to, guys will say, man, I put cover crops out, I've done this, I've done that, and I can't seem to build my carbon. Well, what's your nitrogen levels like? That's the first place to start, and that's the reason why estimating how much is going to be released in your soil is such a big deal. Because we've got soils that release 90 to 150 pounds of N. If we're not accounting for that, because we're just looking at nitrate and organic matter, what we're doing is burning up our carbon. It's the same thing that 10 years ago, looking at variable rates. The reason why I was against variable rate early in my life was because variable rate was just used to reallocate budget basically back then. It wasn't used with any real awesome brains behind it. What it was doing is, hey, this is 300 bushel corn, this is 100, let's put more money over here. But ultimately what we were doing is we're evening out the fields because we were dropping the potential of these 300s. We were putting so much fertility out that we were burning up the carbon. The reason that place was 300 to begin with is because it recycled and fed nutrients extremely efficiently. What we were doing is actually taking that away by pounding it with more N, pounding it with more N. So what we've done is actually wreck some of our good spots by pushing them too hard. They were high yielding spots when my grandpa farmed it. He didn't put more N out there. They're high yielding then. So you don't need more high, you don't need to keep pushing these high yield areas. They're high yielding for a reason. Does that make sense to you guys? This whole thing of variable rate is amazing technology, but I think we've used it wrong in a lot of scenarios. And that's what this soil test is there to do, is help you identify that. Again, I always say, there's really no reason why you want to see these soil tests build. You hear guys say, I want to change my base saturations, this. Base saturations are important, but they're there to identify weaknesses and strengths. I don't try to change base saturations. For one, if I'm in a 25 CTC soil, which is my average, and I try to take a 2% base at K to a 5% like they want, I could have retired. That's $1,900 an acre worth of fertility. And then the shock to that system. What we want to do is manage around the constraints. And again, why build something up? I'll use another example. How many times have you guys went and pulled a high yielding area of your field, sampled it versus a low? How many guys? Probably everybody, right? And what do you find? Is it way higher fertility where it's high yielding? Like 1 out of 100 times it is. The other 99 times it's actually higher fertility on the soil test where it's low yielding. And the reason why is because that soil is not efficient at releasing it. The reason why the 300 bushel area or 300 is because it's efficient at releasing it, because it has the carbon, it has the microbes, it has the efficiency of breaking that total pooled inorganic and then feed that plant. Make sense?
Why didn't you come last summer and talk?
So phosphorus. Phosphorus, again, this is, when we originally got on this track, this was the nutrient that got us there. The reason why I was so intrigued with going a different direction was because I understood biology had a gigantic impact on how much phosphorus got released in the plant. Am I cutting under something?
Yeah, we think there might be something wrong with that.
Check. Thank you. I couldn't tell, so I'm glad you did. So again, the guy that never applies phosphorus, top 3 producer, the guy that applies more phosphorus than anybody I know, except Iowa hog farms, one of the bottom, right? That's what I mentioned earlier, bottom at total phosphorus in that plant. So what we've always looked at all our lives is Olsen and Bray, maybe Melick 3 too, right? I'll use Olsen and Bray. I used to determine, do I want to use Olsen or do I want to use Bray? I'd say if it's high pH, I'd use an Olsen extract. If it's low pH, I'd use a Bray, right? That was pretty natural. Again, pH is determinant. A huge driver of phosphorus release. The reason, well, I'll wait. I think I might have a slide on that. But the other part I want to bring up right now is a perfect opportunity is, if you remember, I said this Lawrence, his 2s and 4s and 5s and 6s never went to 0. The reason they didn't go to 0, and it's something I just never understood, is that we have organic forms of P, high levels of organic forms of P in our soil. If we have organic forms of P in our soil, it does us no good unless we have biology, but we all have some biology, right? So that biology then is breaking down that organic form and spoon feeding it into the inorganic form. And actually, it's the best way to feed a plant. It's better than building up our soils to ultra high levels. And it's, because if you think about it, if you think of those 3 pools again, that far right pool is the little one, right? It's getting picked on all the time. Once it's in that form, it has no shield. There's no way to protect it. Everything in that soil is bullying it. Your calcium's going after it. Your aluminum's going after it. Your iron's going after it. And once it's tagged, it's going back to the middle ball, okay? So again, what you actually want is a system that's just constantly spoon feeding. So if I can put my phosphorus out in a form that's organic and let it trickle into inorganic 2 to 5 to 8 pounds a day, that's a great system. So in other words, Lawrence, again, when I'm talking about them 2s and 7s, we're outperforming it because of that reason. Does that make sense to you guys? It's 2 forms, they always work together, and it's really important to understand it because guys will, at least 5 times a week I'll hear, well, I put 200 pounds of phosphorus out last year, 200 pounds this year, 200 pounds, you know, etc. But I don't see my phosphorus levels moving. Well, the reason they're not moving is because all they're doing is going into that big pool. You can't keep, again, your soil itself is so complex, especially heavy soils. If you get into light sands, which get into 3-4 CEC soils, that's different. You've got a lot more opportunity. In my opinion, they're a lot funner to work with. When you get into heavy soils, you've got so much contamination in these heavy soils that they just keep attacking anything that's in that available pool. This is I've used this slide forever, but this is not very far from my house. This grower asked me to come look at his wheat. I come out and look at his wheat, and I said, man, it's phosphorus deficient. I tissue tested it, but I could see visually that it was, maybe hard for you guys to see here. Took a soil test, and actually the grower said to me, I really doubt it, because I put a lot of phosphorus out here. I'm like, well, let's test it. So we test it, and I'll be danged, the crappy looking wheat actually had higher phosphorus, right? But then we looked at P saturation. This is something that our lab brought in. That's basically, again, that organic root exudate that we use to extract. What it's doing, the P saturation score, what it actually is doing is taking your total phosphorus that we can excrete out of the soil with the living plant, and then it's comparing it to the iron and aluminum that's getting excreted out of that soil with the same strength extraction, right? The same root exudate. So when you have a high score, 60%, it's telling you that you're overcoming the tie-up. It's got enough phosphorus there to satisfy all the iron and aluminum. If you've got a low score, what it's telling you is that it's going to tie up. So in other words, I have 10 times more available phosphorus in that healthy looking wheat than I did in the tough looking wheat. And again, if I would have stopped here, which we had for the last 70 years of life, we would have never known it was phosphorus. So what we did to fix this field, there was a lot of acres, I'd say it was 60, 80 acres of this half section that was affected. We actually limed it. The reason we limed it is because we knew that the iron and aluminum was attacking the phosphorus based on this score. So what we did is neutralize the iron and aluminum by raising the pH, and we're probably down to 3 or 4 acres of tough looking wheat there now, instead of 60 or 80. If we'd have just added more phosphorus, it would have never fixed this, ever. All it would have done is taken that phosphorus, put it in the pool that none of us have looked at, the total pool, and it never built our phosphorus scores. Okay? So again, in low pH, what we're concerned about is iron and aluminum. In high pH, we're very concerned about calcium. But if I had to pick a battle, I would go on the 7.2 range before I'd go down to the 4.8, 5.2 range, because again, the iron and aluminum becomes much more active the lower the pH drops. So then, typical phosphorus sources, I'm guessing we're all in the same boat here, but probably the dominant source is MAP. You can look at 1034O and DAP, obviously, and then rock phosphate's another one that you're hearing more and more about, especially in the soil health world, right? Rock phosphate is it's bringing back what we talked about earlier, putting more in the organic state and let it break down into the inorganic state in a spoon-fed application. It's got some calcium in it. There's some value there. But again, if I had to pick one, especially for something I'm trying to get a return on my investment this year, it's going to be MAP because it's very quick to release as far as forms of phosphorus are. The other thing that I like to mention is just the pH of MAP is much lower than that of DAP, right? I think you're at a roughly, off the top of my head, 3.5 pH of MAP, where DAP is closer to 7.5. So again, if you're in a high pH system, you definitely don't want to add DAP to your system, right? I'd go with MAP. I guess I kind of said that already, but the important thing here is don't use rock phosphate in a high pH environment. It just doesn't break down very well. So I also threw in this, just factors affecting. I get this question all the time, so I threw it in here. In a starter grow on ortho or a poly, I really don't get too caught up in it. Again, if I'm putting high loads out, I would be more cautious about what I'm doing, but I typically am just dribbling. I don't want much out there. I actually believe that if we put too much in a band, we're ruining the association that we have the opportunity to gain with our microbes if we get too hot of a band with either salt or any nutrient. Phos is a big one. So again, if I'm running microbes with it, let's just say I'm purchasing microbes, then of course it becomes more of an issue because I want a really low salt content, right? So I'm looking at food grade type in that scenario. This is just an efficiency factor when we're making recommendations, if we're going to apply in the fall versus top dressing the band, right? So right there, when you have phosphorus at 1,000 liters done, and you can look at that and you understand that, hey, I can save 35% of that just by applying it at the right time. And I'll get more into that when we get into the high yield side. But we've got just a boatload of data on this. So key factors, again, that affect phosphorus, there they are. There's a lot of things that go on, and ultimately, I'm not saying that you have to understand all these things. All I'm saying is our soil test looks at every one of these things and then ranks how well that soil is going to release that nutrient. So you don't have to know any of this because we're going to simplify it. But this is the ambition, or this is the product behind the number. Potassium, this one here, I believe has become very important. I think that we've learned so much. We used to believe that as long as your base sets were decent, you kept feeding the plant K, right? If base set case were 3% or greater, typically we didn't get a response. That was always what we were told. What I really want to show you is that we get extremely big responses even when you have base set Ks of 3 to 5%. Because just because they're in that form that we're extracting in the lab doesn't mean they're available to the crop. So this here is a test that we did not very far from my house. But again, base saturations was a 4.1%. So again, shouldn't trigger a response. Ammonium acetate was a 164. But in reality, what happened is our H3A extraction, again, that root exit extraction, said we should get a response. So all we did is put a little in 2 by 2. We split this field all the way up and down. It's a quarter, so basically 80 acres got it, 80 acres didn't. And we ended up at 27 bushel or something difference. And it's something that the old soil test would have never identified. And the reason it doesn't identify it very well, and again, I guess this is another one from Dr. Bob Miller. I don't know if you work with him or know him, but he's done a lot. He's actually our lab proficiency guy. A lot of labs work with him. But he basically showed the same thing. He had some 290 part per million soil tests, 5.8% base ads, where he applied extra K in season, he still got 33 more bushels of corn. I'm just saying this because what happens in a lab is you take your soil, you bring it in. A lot of labs are using a lot of heat to dry that. So in other words, you get shrinking and swelling there, okay? And then you're re-wetting it with ammonium acetate or malic 3. Well, ammonium acetate or malic 3, especially ammonium acetate, is very, very powerful stuff, right? It's strong. We don't have the luxury of letting our plants basically pee out ammonium acetate. If we did, that test would be great, but they don't pee out ammonium acetate, so we shouldn't look at it, because in heavy clays, it overestimates how much K is released from that soil at a high level. And the last 2 slides prove that. So what we do differently, I guess, is we air dry rather than heat dry. And then when we extract, we look at the AA like everybody else does, but then we compare it to the H3A. And H3A is our bigger driver of indicating when we're going to get a response to potassium, much like the slides I just showed. If we have a 65 part per million or greater in the plant available form, typically we won't get a response to potassium. But we do manage that throughout the season because some soils actually build throughout the year and some soils deplete very quickly throughout the year. So in our tissue program, we actually soil test once in the beginning and once in the end, and that's primarily because of potassium. We want to understand how well it's going to release that K. So again, what affects that is going to be, microbes have some to do with it, a lot less to do with K, in my opinion, than phosphorus and nitrogen. But they still have somewhat to do with it, but more than anything, it's your type of clays that are going to determine how tightly it's going to hold that K or when it's going to release it. And then, of course, moisture is a huge concern there, too. Because, again, clays are attracting that potassium, and if you don't have moisture to break that bond down, hydrogen to break that bond down, then it can't get into the plant. So some of the things that we like to do is adjust our H3A K rates based on rainfall. So if I'm in an area that's going to get spoon-fed water, right, through a drip or something, then we can back that way off. In fact, I think our numbers need to be 45 part per million throughout the entire season where we have irrigation. But let's just say now we're in western North Dakota, we want those numbers 75, 80 because they get way less rainfall, so it's harder to keep enough K in solution in that environment to keep that plant fed, especially late in the year when we really need it. And then again, in the high yield stuff, I'll talk more about timings of K, but the big part of K is you want enough to get started, but in reality, your biggest bang for your buck's always going to come in your reproductive stages. So if I'm only going to soil test one time for K, it's going to come at R2. The reason I'm checking R2 is because I realize if I can't have a 45 part per million in solution at that time, I'm going to start that crop. And K is extremely important in the reproductive stages of that crop to maximize sugar movement and nitrogen in that plant as well. And by the way, magnesium, we talked about it earlier. It's a huge, huge issue in potassium. If you Which is say you go home and you don't ever use anything that we talk about here. Even on a standard soil test, this works really well. Take your potassium, divide it by your magnesium, okay? So your ppm, so let's just say I've got 100 potassium, I've got 200 magnesium. That's a 0.5, okay? A 0.5 tells you a lot about your soil and how well it's going to release that potassium. Now again, we have the luxury of H3A, which say you don't have that. When you get to a 1-to-1, that K becomes extremely efficient. For every pound of K we apply, it's actually going to get into the plant. You get to a 0.5 or less, and basically half to 60% of that pound of K is actually going to tie so tightly to your magnesium that your crop will never see it. So that mag has a gigantic effect, not only on your root structure, but also just how magnetically polar strong, I guess you could say, it will attract that potassium, okay? There's ways around that too. We can talk about that if we have questions later. Another big detriment, I guess, to potassium and sodium, and as you talk about water quality, right, sodium becomes an issue. When you get heavy sodium into the soil, what ends up happening is that plant takes up sodium because it looks a lot like potassium. Okay, so when it takes it up, it's actually, if you ever combine, and I know we've got it a lot around us, but you'll see these stunted dark green plants at harvest time. What that actually is they're green, everything else is mature, but they don't have much manure any year at times, and it's because they basically blew up from the inside out. They took sodium into the plant, thinking it was potassium or acting like potassium, and then it basically blows up its inside, and it doesn't get into reproduction. So we see a lot of that. It's like I say, you've got to manage your K based off your mag and your sodium. You always have to be looking at those two nutrients every time I'm thinking about potassium. And again, here's our efficiency chart. A big thing I want to add is never add potassium to a field that's got zero hydrogen in it. So what you say we soil test this fall, we say we need 250 pounds of potassium. Let's just make this up. If I've got, on my base saturations, if I've got 0% hydrogen, I will never get that potassium into my crop because there's no place for it to store. If there's 0% hydrogen, you instantly have to look at either in season or pre-season, preferably in season, never fall. What'll happen is, again, all you're going to do is build up that huge pool that you're never measuring and the pool that none of us seem to care about. You're never going to get that converted into the available form because there's no place for it to cover. So if you think of a cation exchange capacity, let's just say you've got a CEC of 20 for simplicity. Let's just think about it as we're opening our cupboards up, there's 20 shelves there. If there's no hydrogen there, right, that's the only thing potassium's strong enough to kick out of the cupboard is hydrogen. It can't kick out magnesium, it can't kick out calcium, okay? It's not strong enough. They're double positive, I'm a single positive, so I'm not strong enough to do it. So if there's no hydrogen, when I open that cupboard, don't apply K, because you're not gonna get any money back from that potassium application. Very, very rarely will you get money back from that application. Now, you can do things, you can add hydrogen in your system, right? So, for instance, what happens when we add a bunch of ammonium sulfate? When ammonium sulfate breaks down and feeds the end, it's going to leave a hydrogen available in that root zone. So if I'm banning that AMS, I'm basically artificially putting hydrogen in that system. So there's things you can do about it, but I'm just saying, as a great management, you want to look at your hydrogen before you apply potassium. So sources, again, chloride, potassium chloride is probably the most common, right? And then you've got your SOP, your KTS, and K-acetate. Potassium acetate's a great tool if you're going to foliar feed, or a great tool if you're extremely deficient, you need a quick jump. Not a great product as far as maintaining throughout the season, right? It's just a quick fix. Typically 10 days is all you're going to see it get in the plant. KTS is a pretty decent product. I don't love it. I think it's pretty slow to release. My favorite choice, if I'm not trying to build the soil and I'm just trying to feed the plant, is to liquefy potassium chloride. So it's basically taking 0,060, melting it down, I have a 0,013. I think there's a lot of value in that. It's an inexpensive product. And again, it's very safe. People get concerned about chloride. I don't get concerned about chloride at all when I'm using it in that form because I'm not using a lot of volume. I might put 20 gallons on throughout the entire season. Now, if I'm trying to build an area, which is say I'm going back to some of these guys that want me to build these base ads. Now, in that scenario, if I believed in that, I'd be using something like SOP because I don't want to put 500 pounds of potassium chloride. It's really, really hard in biology at that level. It's not hard at 60 to 150 pounds. We've tested it, and we see very little change in biological activity at 60 to 150 pounds. So again, the potassium, I talked about it earlier, but keep it in the reproductive stages has a big effect on nitrogen cells itself. So the process in which amino acids are arranged into proteins needs sugar, right? It needs movement in the plant, and K has a big role in that. And again, I think I got slides on that earlier, so I'm later, so I'm below it. But some things that we look at that go into our ranking system on potassium is these things. Again, your structure of your soil, your K to mag, your Cal to mag, your CEC, and then again, how much hydrogen. I should have put that, I guess pH is part of that, right? If I've got low pH, I'm gonna have hydrogen. If I have high pH, I'm not gonna have hydrogen, right? So that's pretty simple. Calcium, this is one that is probably the biggest struggle of every nutrient that we talk about. Out of every tissue test that we run, this is the most efficient nutrient that we'll ever see. We see it in every state in the United States, basically. Very rarely does a soil test do a good job of predicting calcium. Most of us are applying calcium based off pH, right? Line. We're adjusting. The only reason we're out there is because we're trying to adjust the pH, which the pH is important. But I want you to think about calcium differently. I want you to think about calcium in the ammonium acetate form and the pH form more of a soil builder. So again, you hear these guys that want to see you at 3.5 or 4 to 1 on calcium and magnesium. The reason they want that is for soil structure. Again, magnesium stacks like this on top of each other, okay? It just stacks end over end. So you drive over it when it's wet, what happens? That's that tight, hard rock concrete soil. You get high calcium and it stacks like this. Really important for structure, aggregation, and for oxygen, and for nutrients, right? So when you look at your AAs, or your base hats, that's what you're affecting, is your structure. When you're looking at soil pH, obviously that's a chemistry, so we're trying to adjust it with carbonates. But the part that we've all missed out on, ourselves included, is paying more attention to that plant-available calcium form. And they're oftentimes extremely different. You can have an 80% base set, an 8.0 pH, and not get enough calcium in the plant. And the reason that is because the calcium's in the wrong form. If I got calcium in the calcium carbonate form, that's an insoluble form that crop's never going to see. Okay, so when we're heavy irrigators, what are we doing? We're adding carbonates and bicarbonates all the time. If they fix for their calcium, what's happening is we're making a perfectly good plant food source not good at all anymore, because it's changed the forms and the crop doesn't even recognize it as a food source, okay? So we're looking at all three of them, and I think it's important. So again, bad indicators of available calcium is pH, it's terrible. Ideal balance doesn't mean much. And again, the perfect Cal to mag ratios have an effect on structure of the soil, but rarely have an effect on truly what that plant is seeing as plant food. Calcium sources, calcium carbonate I mentioned earlier. It's a line. We can change pH, but it doesn't change what the crop necessarily sees. Calcium phosphate, again, we talked about that earlier. Rock phosphate, very similar, right? Calcium sulfate, calcium nitrate, calcium chloride. If I had my choice, I'd take calcium chloride. Again, a cation and an anion together is good. Cations tend to not move that well. But when you put an anion with it, they do it. I always say calcium chloride almost makes calcium slippery. You can put calcium chloride in a wide drop application and see it in the plant in 5-6 days. Most calcium sources are much, much slower than that. Humates. Anybody try humates around here? So humates have a big role in cations. For one, they're going to decontaminate. They tie up a lot of things that are holding nutrition back. But for two, as biological activity happens, L-amino acids are created. And L-amino acids basically really help that plant take up calcium. So you'll see some calcium sources that will be stacked with amino acids. The reason they're stacked with that is, again, it's just the transportation of that nutritional element into the crop. But consistently, where we apply more humates, humics, fulvics, you typically get, not necessarily fulvics, I should take that back, humates and humics, you're going to see more calcium in the crop, and potentially potassium as well. So again, calcium availability, we really believe that there's a strong correlation to high yields in calcium. If you can start the plant off with enough calcium, it builds structure. Structure is important because the last half of the year, if you don't have the stalk in the vascular system, it doesn't matter what we feed it, right? I heard earlier Stephen say, when you paired fungicide with nitrogen, you got a better response to the nitrogen, right? Well, the reason that was because you had a healthier plant. Same thing happens when you build the structure early in the vascular system early with calcium. You have to have it, otherwise you don't get that girthy stalk, that stem. And then late in the year, what happens is that stalk and stem start to pinch. And when that pinches, you get less translocation late. So again, what's holding that back is your cations. Your cations are keeping your pipeline free. So again, we pay a lot of attention to calcium because it ties extremely well to high yield. And then ultimately what we do is we try to simplify the system. Like I told you earlier, we're going to rank everything from a 1 to a 5. Let's just say this is your zone map. Why we zone is because we want to pay attention to which soils are going to stay wet, which ones are going to dry out the fastest, okay? And what slope of hill that we're dealing with, what sunlight it's going to get. The reason this is important is because when you're looking at things such as mineralization, mineralization is going to be tied to pH, microbes, and moisture. So if you don't have a map like this, it just makes our soil test a little less accurate. You know, I tell guys if they're going to deposit sample, I would do the cheap test, I wouldn't do our good test because there's too many things, too many variables thrown into that bag. The same reason why I don't like to measure anything by yield. I don't build zone maps based off yield is because there's 100 reasons why I have good yield, there's 100 reasons why I have bad yield. You throw all 100 reasons into a bag and I can't help you a lot. So I hate yield tied maps, so I typically go with topography and water. And then ultimately we sample it, right? Now we're going to rank how well that nutrient's going to release. So this is nitrogen. If it ranks a 1, we're going to use 1.25 units of N to create a bushel. If it ranks a 5, we're going to use 0.55 units of N per bushel. So a gigantic difference between a 5 and a 1. Now granted, we don't find a lot of 5s. But my point here is, that's what that field looks like after we zoned it, and we basically ranked every soil type and how well it's going to release nitrogen. And then ultimately what we do is we overlay yield after that, okay? So, I thought I had a better picture here. Well, I kind of, okay. If you look at, this is the yield map, okay? This purple basically is 210, 220. This is like one of my dad's farms, okay? If you look at that map versus this nitrogen map, this was all purple in here. But ultimately what we do is stack those two maps, and then it's going to create a variable rate strip where even though that whole area is, it's hard to see here, it's 220, we're going to range roughly 90 pounds of N different for the same exact yield goal because we understand that soil is going to release nitrogen very well. And if we didn't adjust for it, ultimately what we're doing is taking away soil health and taking away efficiency of potassium, calcium, sulfur, chloride, a lot of other things. So when we hammer too much in on soils that don't need the N because naturally I'm going to bring it down and give you that, it's a negative in every direction, not including economics, but every other part of it too. So again, I like to, what percent of your dollar do you think you're getting back? When you put $1 out of fertilizer, what percent of that? How many quarters? What are you getting back? Let's have a vote. How many think that you're getting 90 cents back out of $1?
After your talk, like 10.
What's that?
I'm only getting like 10 back after your talk.
Do you think you're getting 75 cents? 50 cents? Yeah, a few 50s. 25? Yeah, basically you add up all the nutrients together. The best case scenario that I've seen is 35 cents out of your dollar. You know, what a rotten investment, right? I mean, if we can't do better than that, well, that's sad. And everything that we do, so let's just say you're getting 35 cents out of that dollar, well, the other 65 cents is a detriment, right? The other 65 cents, all it is insoluble salts. It's killing us. It's not only in our pocketbook, but it's taking away carbon, it's taking away soil life, it's taking away everything that we want out of this dang thing. The whole entire system has to rely on that 35 versus that 65. And most guys aren't even at 35. I actually think most guys are closer to 20, okay? So again, that's why we needed a better system. That's why we do what we do. I don't think we're at 50 cents even when we manage it, but we're a heck of a lot closer than the standard management system is. I know that for a fact. We've got a lot of trials that we can cut back on fertilizer by 50 to 70% if it's timed right in the right forms and the right synergistic things, and out yield the stuff that we put full rates on. So I'll save this for after dinner. Any questions on the soil test or anything we do, I guess? I don't know, where are we at for time? Dinner time probably, right? Right. Any questions on this? Yeah, you bet.
What's it take to get your swap maps?
What's it?
Like, what's it take for a grower to get your swap maps?
Well, I will make sure I touch on that. So we don't do SWOT, well, we do SWOT maps, but it's very few percent. So SWOT maps is an awesome tool. What he's talking about is soil, water, and topography. It's a company out of Canada that does a great job. They run a EN38 across the field, right? And it tells you down to 36 inches the soil changes. What we actually use most of the time is recreated, basically try to re-mimic that map through imageries. So we do that. We probably do, if we do 200,000 acres a year, whatever, we'll probably run 180,000 of them through that system and only 20,000 of them through the SWOT. Not because there's anything wrong with SWOT, just because we think that we can do a really good job and not go across the field. If we get into North Dakota, we still run a lot of SWOT, or western South Dakota, because of the subsoil saline issues that you can't identify with imagery. You know, it's usually 18, 20 inches down, where SWOT does a tremendous job of pulling that out. But otherwise, all it is an email, and they can create your maps. Any other questions? Yep.
Getting started on cover crops, what would you recommend? What kind of mix, or what would you start
For
with?
cover crops? What kind of mix? I look at my CN ratio. If my CN ratio is low, I don't want to have anything heavy in brassicas or legumes, right? I want to get more of the grass species out there. So I'll give you a great example of that. Again, Joe and I get back from, I think it was 2005. We get back from this meeting. I plant cover crops the first year. I just can't wait. Plant radishes, because that's what they talk about so much as radishes. I actually do like a 7-way mix. But anyway, my radishes got about that tall out of the ground and went about that far into the ground. And pretty disappointing. I was already getting made fun of from my dad because we're in a dry environment. Why would you waste that moisture? And then I've got these huge fence post radishes out there that really aren't doing what I told them they were going to do. Ultimately, about 3 years later, again, we didn't have a soil test that told us this at the time, but I realized that if I didn't put enough carbon there, I couldn't soften up the soil. So I started going really, really heavy on my grasses. I did 7 to 10 way mixes of just grasses. Once that carbon got built up, now when I run a radish, there's that much out of the ground. You know, it's going directly in. So start with building the carbon if the carbon's not there already, and don't look at organic matter, look at WEOC. Once your WEOC levels are high and your CN ratio is greater than 10 to 1, 12 to 1 in there, that's when you can start doing more of the mixes where you're getting more legumes and brassicas in it. Until then, I would stay heavy on my grasses. Is that it? That was easy. That's weak. All right, thank you guys.